Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family. Chapter 1, Part 9, War Echo Approaches. Read by Natalia Buzova. By the summer of 1942, life in the city of Petigorsk had changed in many ways, turned pale and impoverished. A disturbing echo of war was approaching. The hospitals were overflowing with the wounded. At night, we more and more often went on raids, combing mountains and forests as well as certain areas of the city, including checking apartments. We were looking for parachutists dropped from the plane, then deserters of Caucasian nationality. Meanwhile, a monstrous war raged on a vast territory. At the end of July, the Germans took Rostov and the fighting spread to the Kuban. Clanking tracks, gloomy tanks with crosses on their armor crawled impudently and insolently to the south. Following them, pressing machine guns to their sides, hordes of cruel conquerors sowed death in a foreign land. The villages and unharvested bread were burning. Crimson clouds of smoke billowed over the steppe, but they could not cover the bleeding soldiers and refugees whom the fascist vultures hunted with impunity from the air. The tasks were also set to reach the Caucasus, seize its oil regions, then reach the Turkish-Iranian border to develop an offensive in the Middle East and India. Hitler had a planetary appetite. To capture the Caucasus, the Hitlerite command developed the plan called Edelweiss. A strong grouping of troops was created, in which there were 167,000 soldiers and officers, 1,130 tanks, 4,540 guns, and up to 1,000 aircraft. The offensive began on the 25th of July. 3 tank corps, supported by aviation, dealt a strong blow to the 37th Army and broke through the front 60 kilometers wide. Tank and motorized formation of the enemy rushed into the breakthrough. Shooting down and bypassing weak barriers in their path, they quickly advanced in the direction of Krasnodar, Stavropol, and Novorossiysk. A real threat was created to the Caucasus. The enemy had to be stopped at any cost. The breakthrough of the Germans to Stalingrad and to the Kuban put our country and the Red Army in a difficult situation. Stalin, and under his pressure the General Staff, miscalculated in determining the enemy's main strategic strike in the summer campaign of 1942. They were waiting for it in Moscow, and fresh divisions and new weapons were being brought to it. T-34 tanks, rocket launchers, more advanced aircraft. At the same time, the armies of the Southern Front, which had been drained of blood in previous battles, were almost never replenished. They took up defensive positions on the left bank of the Don at the front of 320 kilometers and consisted of 112,000 fighters, 17 tanks, and 130 aircraft. The enemy did everything to misinform our command that they were not going to attack in the south and that their target was Moscow. And secretly, they were preparing to strike precisely in the south in order to reach the Volga and the Caucasus, and then by deep coverage from the southeast to surround and destroy our troops in central Russia, then to take Moscow by storm, and before the beginning of the second winter, victoriously end the war. On July the 28th, 1942, the well-known order number 227 was issued, signed by Stalin. Its harsh words were about the mortal threat hanging over our motherland. They condemned apostasy sentiments, the lack of stability of individual units and formation, the lack of proper discipline and order in them. the order outlined measures to strengthen the stamina and combat effectiveness of the troops. Mirage detachments were created, which shot the retreating soldiers on the spot. The commanders who had allowed their subordinates to retreat were brought to the trial by the revolutionary tribunals. No step back. That was the main requirement of the order. The defense of the Caucasus was entrusted by the headquarters to the Transcaucasian Front, since the Southern Front had lost contact with the troops and ceased to exist. From Transcaucasia, troops began to move to the border of the Terek River, where it was planned not only to stop, but also to defeat the enemy. Only then, a replenishment of people and weapons began to come there. At the same time, an advanced defensive line was created along the Kuma River. All local reserves were drawn there. The 12th Training Regiment, Poltava Auto Tractor, Novocherkassk Cavalry, Rostov Artillery Military Schools, motorized rifle and mortar battalions, short courses, 2 armored train divisions, and other units. These scattered troops were headed by Major General Timofeyev, deputy commander of the 9th Army, which at that time was being reorganized beyond the Terek. General Timofeyev was operatively subordinate to the 11th Division of the NKVD, which covered the target approaches to Mineralные Vody and other resort cities. The headquarters obviously hoped that the combined forces of the 37th Army retreating from Rostov and the detachments of the cover zone of General Timofeyev would be able to stop the enemy at the Kumsky line before the troops of the Transcaucasian Front approached. Stalin was probably so sure of it that he forbade evacuations from resort cities so as not to spread panic. It was an inhuman criminal order, since in Pyatigorsk, Kislovodsk, Zheznovodsk, and Yessentuki, there were several tens of thousands of wounded front-line soldiers at that time. By this order of the Supreme, most of them were doomed to fascist captivity and death. Stalin also did not fully realize in what deplorable state the troops of the Southern Front were retreating to the foothills of the Caucasus. The 37th Army had lost all its artillery and tanks on the Don. Only about 3,000 people remained, almost unarmed and psychologically depressed. Exhausted and hungry, one by one and in groups, they wandered through Pyatigorsk to the cherished Nalchik, the place of the reorganization of the army. It was out of the question to use them at the Kumsky frontier. At the same time, the forward detachments of the cover zone were not able to offer serious resistance to the armored horde of the enemy, since they were poorly armed. They had only rifles, grenades, machine guns, and rare anti-tank rifles, and 45mm guns with a limited amount of ammunition. They could stop the enemy temporarily until the approach of the main forces. In connection with the escalation at the front, classes at the school were terminated. Our battalion was preparing for the final exams. A technician lieutenant uniform had already been prepared for each of us. Some commanders said that a representative of the front or a military district was expected to arrive for the exams. Others that we would graduate without exams, and still others that the school would be evacuated deeper to the rear. And it turned out that those cadets who a month later withdrew and survived in the battles were sent to the city of Mari of the Turkmen SSR and received officer ranks there, and those who were killed in the battle or were captured, like me, remained cadets forever. In the last days, our girls anxiously asked what would happen next if the Germans came there too. Once, such a question was posed to me by my Katya Golavinova. No, they won't get through here, I answered, as our commanders told us. Soon they will face the music. But on the 4th of August, it became clear that the enemy was somewhere nearby. At night, part of the cadets, about 700 people, were alerted and thrown into the Kumsky line in motor vehicles. They took away almost all the weapons available in the units. There were 20-30 rifles left in the companies for guard duty and patrolling the city. This separate cadet battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Kanevsky, together with the other troops of the cover zone, met the enemy vanguard units at the Kumsky line and detained them for 2 days, forcing them to turn around along the front. Then, from August the 8th to September the 3rd, the retreating battalion conducted containment battles along the Georgievsk-Prokhladny line. In the battle for the city of Prokhladny, the battalion lost almost half of its strength and was removed from the combat area and then sent to the new location of the school. The material of the school, as well as 500 cadets of a new set, were urgently taken out of Petigorsk. There remained about 500-600 of us old-timers left in 2 towns. We continued to carry out internal and garrison service and provided order in the city. We also worked on evacuating military property and state values. We saw and felt the approach of the front with our own eyes when retreating units, groups of fighters, and single soldiers of the 37th Army began to pass through the city. Exhausted, dirty, and hungry, they said angrily that the Germans had a lot of tanks, planes, mortars, cars, motorcycles, and they only had rifles. From Rostov itself, they broke out of the encirclement on foot. I saw such a Red Army soldier, barefoot, riding a bull with a carbine over his shoulders. The picture was both funny and bitter. Not at all like those that we sometimes saw in films, where, as a rule, dirty Germans ran and our soldiers pursued them. There were cadets at the Lermontov patrol, as well as along various paths leading to Petigorsk. Retreating subunits and groups of fighters led by commanders were allowed through without special checks, and the lonely ones were detained and their weapons were taken away. They were sent to assembly points for checking. Stopping and checking them, we, who had not smelt the front line gunpowder, strictly, reproachfully looked into their eyes, suspecting almost every potential deserter or a coward fleeing from the battlefield. This is how our discerning political workers set us up. This chaotic retreat had ceased by August the 6th. There was an ominous pause that lasted 3 days. It was for that period that the troops of the cover zone were able to detain the enemy's tank armada at the Kum line and enable the 37th Army to break away from the advancing enemy. The most terrible and pitiful thing happened on August the 7th. From the hospitals in Petigorsk and other resort cities, the wounded who could walk on their own were allowed to move. The doctors announced to them, those who can move, leave, in order to avoid captivity and executions. And they reached out in rows to Nalchik. It was an eerie picture. There was a 30-degree heat, and those people in hospital clothes, with bandages on their heads, arms and legs, supporting each other, walked with difficulty along the dusty road to the south. and at the same time, their seriously wounded comrades stayed put, doomed to fascist camps, torment, and death. From the morning of August the 8th, all the shops in the city were open for free distribution of food and goods to the population. By the evening, government offices and just offices were empty. Shrewd inhabitants dragged furniture, carpets, rugs, dishes from there, and the cadets were still at their post, loaded military equipment onto the vehicles without knowing that a difficult combat exam awaited for them the next day. For a more complete understanding of the situation at that time, I will cite an excerpt from the conversation of the former commander of the 12th Company, Senior Lieutenant Kirillov, now a retired colonel, with the former first secretary of the Pyatigorsk City Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, Borokhov, whom he, on the instructions of the head of the school, visited in a hospital in Tbilisi, where he was treated after being wounded. Kirillov, how could it happen that until the very last days an incomprehensible carelessness reigned in the city? The wounded and a huge amount of food for hospitals stored in the underground cold storage facility were not taken out. Borokhov, yes, it was a tragedy. We knew about the rapid advance of the Germans from Rostov to the foothills of the Caucasus, but I, as the Commissar of the Defense Committee of Resort Cities, had received an order from the Supreme Commander not to start evacuation, so as not to spread panic. Stalin argued that the enemy would be stopped and defeated at the Kumsky line, and the Pearl of the Caucasus would not surrender to the enemy. We believed in Stalin infinitely, and his order encouraged us. However, on August the 6th, I was informed that the enemy tanks had been spotted near Mineralные Vody. I went there with a small group of cadets, and we managed to set fire to army warehouses with uniforms. It became clear that the following day, or the day after it, the Germans would break into Pyatigorsk. Therefore, I ordered all government agencies and organizations to leave the city and open shops and warehouses for the population. If I had my way, I would have sent to the rear at least the seriously wounded a few days before in motor vehicles that had gone through our city to Nalchik. But that threatened with general panic, violation of the will of the Supreme. The reprisal for such arbitrariness could be abrupt. Kirillov, how were you injured? Borokhov, on the morning of August the 9th, I was in the State Bank, near which there were concentrated 40 motor vehicles loaded with state values, which had flocked there from all the banks in the North Caucasus. And I was personally responsible for them. I had about 50 policemen and several responsible people. At about 12 in the afternoon, the column left Pyatigorsk for Georgievsk. On the central road towards Nalchik, we did not dare to go, fearing that enemy aircraft was controlling the main highway and could bomb us. In addition, it was filled with thousands of wounded. They would stop, demand that they should be given a lift, be indignant that the militia was running off, and they were not taken. We could not tell them that we were carrying money, gold, and valuables worth millions of rubles. Therefore, we went in a roundabout way, not very noticeable from the air. In the evening, we ran into German motorcyclist scouts. There was a fierce firefight. I was driving in a car on which the Germans fired several rounds, and I was seriously wounded. But the column broke through to Prokhladny. There is something to think about here. A dozen motor vehicles would have been enough for money, gold, and real valuables. But as Borokhov admitted, they were carrying hundreds of busts of Lenin and Stalin, even several monuments. There was no way to leave them in Pyatigorsk. Special emissaries of the state security kept a watchful eye on that. So the statues of communist idols were saved, and the wounded defenders of the motherland were thrown to the mercy of fate.